Sunday Times. Dmitri Beliakov, photographer, is a freelance photojournalist, videographer, researcher, and a producer from Russia, and he has more than 25 years' experience in the field. And Sergey Ponomarev is a freelance photographer based in Moscow in Russia, best known for his work covering wars and conflict in the Middle East as the migrant crisis in Europe. His photos of the migrant crisis won him first prize in World Press Photo Contest and in the general news category. Russian photographers Sergey Ponomarev and Dmitri Beliakov have covered many conflicts, but the ongoing one in Ukraine is much closer to home. They share some of their own hardest experience and insights in finding that balance in a volatile environment. Please come to the stage, Ray Wells, Dmitri Beliakov, and Sergey Ponomarev.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. And thank you for coming and welcome. And also, I should say that for our colleagues who can't be here, not because they don't want to, hello to them because they'll be watching remotely, I'm sure, and that's great. With us this evening, we've got our two photographers, as Lars has said, Sergey Ponomarev and Dmitri Beliakov, and we're going to be talking about this line. Is there one? Where do you draw it? And their own experiences in the field in a very particular conflict. A lot of the time when we talk about dangers and the difficulties of operating, it's a broad area. It could be the same wherever you are. But for these two particular photographers, the conflict that we're going to be going into, first of all, is a very different one. But in the first instance, perhaps we could just look at some of their work.
По шахте бьют.
Здесь забор был. Вот видите, его выгнуло вот и вот. Мы стояли возле дома, он догорал. Муж в это время умирал. Дороги в больницу. Вот это его цепочка мне в морге отдали. Цепочка с колечком. Вот оно погнутое какое. Больше у меня ничего нет. Теперь буду носить.
Ты в школу ходишь?
Нет.
А почему?
Моя школа находится на 7-й, но ее разбомбили. У меня попал в дом снаряд.
И ты это видел?
Да, на моих глазах. Сколько людей погибло? Это тысячи людей. Это не 10, не 20 человек, это тысячи.
And so, as you can see, Dima grew up north of Moscow, and the picture there is particularly significant in a way because he served in the Soviet army in the late 80s as a military translator, and then as an operator in the electronic intelligence battalion in the Baltics. He's still a young man by the time he left the army, and that was when he first picked up an old Zenit camera which belonged to a friend of his from Latvia. And that's where it all began for him. And since then, you know, he's covered, he specializes in armed conflict and terrorism, and more widely, the loss of freedom in civil society, which is very close to his heart. He covered the Chechen wars for a decade in the North Caucasus, and the infamous Beslan school hospital crisis. And for 5 years, been in and out of the Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and the war in the Donbass, which is what we're going to be particularly talking about first of all, and the humanitarian aftermath of all those things. And as a result of this, you know, his exhibition at the Visa pour l'Image in Perpignan, and also for the Donbass, he was chosen out of 400 photographers to be the one who would try to document the story from both sides, which is significant in ways that I hope that these two will be able to explain. Because I certainly don't understand how difficult it must be. And now Sergey. Now you've already heard from Lars about the extraordinary work that Sergey has done. And but the early part of his life was based in Moscow, and after leaving Moscow State University, he spent a decade working for AP, the Associated Press, learning his craft and learning contacts in the world, generally speaking. And then after that went freelance and began working for the European publications like Paris Match and Figaro, and but more significantly in a way for him, and something which has become of huge importance in his working life, he started to develop a relationship with the New York Times. And again, I mention this specifically because it does relate to the subject that we're hoping to explore here. In recent years, he's been Libya, Iraq, Syria, the places where a lot of the photographers you're used to hearing from have been in and around the region. And as part of a team at the New York Times in 2016, he won a Pulitzer for this coverage of the migrant crisis. His work in Mosul on the offensive also got him a Robert Capa Gold Medal, which I think Lars mentioned as well, so as well as the World Press photo. So a lot of very remarkable pictures from both of these gentlemen. But before we go into that, and I hope you'll bear with me, because this is a particular story. I mentioned that, to Your Highness, that the last time I sat on this stage, it was alongside 3 people who had variously been shot at, blown up, in prison, tortured. And the question then was, why did you do this when you knew that journalists were being targeted and killed? When many others were already deciding that it was simply not worth the risk. Each had their own reason. One, because he felt compelled. One, because he said he grew up in a war zone. And one felt he couldn't leave when his colleague said that she was staying. That was my friend and colleague, Marie Colvin, who died, and he was Paul Conroy. But Dmitri and Sergey understand these reasons and all the old arguments about whether they can make a difference. They're professionals, and often it's enough for professionals to say, look, it's what I do, and then leave it for somebody else to decide whether being shot at for not very much money is in any way a good idea. And many situations are morally also quite straightforward. Here are victims of pain and suffering. We're trying to tell a story where the journalist is maybe a bit of a visitor. But civil wars are much more complicated. You have to pick your side or not. Access usually means the one that your government, and therefore generally your employer, supports. But what if your government takes one side, your employer the other, your country, let alone the one that you're in trying to cover, is divided down the middle of on this subject? Your family, even. I mean, this is Europe's forgotten toxic war, Ukraine. It's not a civil war, politically, because of course Ukraine is an independent country, but emotionally, and that's what makes this subject particularly interesting, I think, in the way that photographers have to operate on the ground. For Russia, this is like no other country. Ukraine is very important, nowhere so important as the Ukraine. Now, I know no one here wants a history lesson, and I'm not a historian, so please forgive me, but it did strike me that a little context might be useful. So 1,000 years ago, the capital, Kiev, was Eastern Europe's chief political and cultural center. The country's history goes back further to Kievan Rus. Some say the cradle of Russian civilization. And religious division began around 1600. The north and the west under the influence of Rome, and the south and the east under the Orthodox Church. By 1800, it had become part of the Russian Empire, and it stayed that way until 1954, when Khrushchev allowed it independent status, because he needed help in being elected president. And at that time, the Ukrainian Communist Party was hugely influential through the heavy industries, which again is a very important part of this story in its relationship with Russia. And even after the Soviet collapse in 1991, giving Ukraine full independence, Russia still remained its chief trading partner. If we jump forward to the Orange Revolution, the country now leaning towards the EU, leaving the Russian sphere of influence. US politicians and European politicians arrive, talking, making a lot of noise. Talk of NATO expansion on Russia's southern border, including Crimea, where the Baltic fleet is. The country is looking to the future, to a new era, apparently. And that's the big hope, that the country will move forward together. But here is a map. I hope we can get the map up on the screen. Now, this is a map of the 2010 presidential election in Ukraine. And basically, you can see that in 500 years, nothing has really changed. The north and the west, including Kiev, are still looking towards Europe. And the blue areas still see themselves as very much part of a greater Russia. And the divide could not be clearer. Now, I'm not drawing immediate comparisons between the religious sides of things, but the fact that it's so clear. We see a lot of this in the world today, where divisions are absolutely stark. This one has been going on for a very long time. And so in 2014, having been given very little practical help by the EU, President Yanukovych, I think, felt he had no choice but to go with Vladimir Putin's Eurasian Customs Union. Protests in Kiev followed, mass demonstrations in the Maidan Square, and that precipitated a brutal response from the dreaded secret police. Yanukovych fled to Russia, the country divided, and Putin stepped in and took back Crimea and Sevastopol, where the fleet are based. And pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian army began a conflict that has never been resolved. Lastly, a colleague of mine who's lived and worked in Moscow for many years said to me that he had spoken to reporters, by which he also, of course, means photographers, who've worked in Ukraine, and since then, they felt that the people back home in Russia saw them as traitors. However hard they tried to be impartial, however hard they tried to be professional. And the question is, in a way, and I'd like to go to Sergey first of all, so when it's not enough to say, I'm a trained professional, what difference does it make? You know, if I work for Stern or the New York Times or the Sunday Times in London, how do you feel about it Is there a line? How hard is it, or has it been, to operate in a country which is seen by many of your compatriots, a country that you love, as still part of Russia?
Well, first you need to feel that yourself, that there is a difference of working for Western media and the way that your fellow countrymen, the patriots, or for example the liberals, treat you. And from the traditional patriot community, it was like a stiff resistance. I was treated clearly like a traitor because I was able, unlike others, enter Ukraine and go and work on the Ukrainian side, and also have ability to enter pro-Russian side in Ukraine.
So you could operate on both sides, and was this relatively straightforward to begin with?
Well, yes, it was. No, I mean there were a lot of difficulties and problems because as Russian, I bear Russian passport. So once I was going through the checkpoint, and I was hardly beaten by the Ukrainian forces just because
you were going through a checkpoint, and then you were beaten by the Ukrainians.
Yes, just because.
What happened?
They stopped us, and they were checking documents, and they saw that I have a Russian passport, although I had all clearance documents, like I've got a permission from security services, I've got permission from intelligence, but I had a Russian passport, and they dragged me out of the car and put a bag on my head, and so beat it. They broke my rib, so it was clearly a very tough experience.
And I think you said to me that they actually broke one of your ribs as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they did.
You didn't mention. Yeah, they broke one of his ribs as well. Yeah.
Well,
how did that make you feel? I mean, because it was happening in a country so, still
it
powerful.
felt terrible, but I had to do my job still. So I went once we were released, and they realized that beside that I am a Russian, I work with various media, mostly with American media, and so my fellow journalists stood for me, and they released us and let me go and enter the separatist territories. I had to continue working and do my job, and I just bought a bunch of painkillers and put a belt on my ribs, a corset, and if there was enough space in the car, so I could lay in the back of a seat, so I will not suffer the bumpy roads. But yeah, I mean, at that place, nobody gives you any excuse. You have to continue working.
I mean, this is the kind of thing that we're used to having happen to our colleagues when they work in places where they are seen as strangers. This is a place that is, for many Russians, considered to be home. Now, I go to Dima because I know that you spent 5 years in and out of the Ukraine, and we've talked in the past. Dima has worked for the paper I used to work for many years, the Sunday Times, and was there on our behalf, just to be clear, on many occasions. You've had also similar experiences to Sergey, where you were working in this area, and tell people what happened, if you can.
I mean that lovely story from the Slavyansk. June 2014, I was with a small group of my colleagues, with my reporter, Marco Franchetti, and our fixer, and we've been wandering in the center of Slavyansk, and out of the blue there was a group of separatists, and they were drunk, and one of them was incredibly aggressive. He started yelling and attacking me, obviously because I was the most colorful from the crew, because I had all these cameras dangling on my shoulders. So he said he believes that all the journalists should be wiped out, and then he took his gun and took off the safety, stuck it into my stomach, and I thought, what's going to happen? If he shoots me in the stomach, then it's not going to be it. He probably will go for Mark, and he probably will go for my fixer, because they are necessary witnesses. And that was not nice, so we had to be incredibly cold-headed and very polite. So we apologized, we pretended that we feel sorry for any inconveniences. You know, it wasn't good, of course, but that's part of the job.
Well, yes, part of the job, but I think for many people the idea of this happening to you so close to home makes it a very particular kind of threat. I was going to come back to Sergey and ask him, do you think working for the New York Times makes you appear to be an enemy in your own country, where generally speaking, the feeling is that the Western press takes a very simple line, often an anti-Putin line, which is nothing really to do with the complexity of the story. So does it make you, do you feel that because of the position, the professional position that you take, that your own countrymen think of you as being part of a Western conspiracy, as it were?
Well, you know, it's more complicated problem, because first of all, you are operating in the war zone, and the war zone always goes along with the propaganda. So any part of the conflict are brainwashed with their own propaganda and their own points of view. In Ukraine, it was pretty clear for us that most of the army and separatists were trying to fight first around the TV towers, so they captured the zone around the TV tower and they switch on their TV channel. So, and then you understand that you are a representative of one of the sides. They judge you by the media that you work with.
Right.
And so, and at that point, it becomes extremely difficult to tell people that you are kind of working in the most respected and the most truthful and adequate media in the world, for example. They will say
But do they believe you?
Of course not.
No.
Of course not. Sometimes my Russian accent helped me a lot. So I teamed up with one of my friends from Kiev who worked for the Time magazine, and I've been working for New York Times magazine. And we were, while we were going through the checkpoints, and you know, while you're driving on the road, there might be a pro-Ukrainian and then pro-Russian and then again pro-Ukrainian checkpoints. So we kind of played a game of a good and bad policeman. So at some checkpoints, I've been speaking with my Russian accent, and pro-Russians said, "Oh, okay, like he's Muscovite, and that's fine." And then on the other checkpoint, there was my friend speaking with Ukrainian accent. So Ukrainians also treated him as his compatriot, and so this is why we try to play this game, because they clearly don't care about the media you work with. They mostly treat you as a citizen of country A or country B.
Exactly, Dima, I mean, I know one of the projects that you have worked on for many years is a relationship with the Russian military, and it's not because of the fact that you served with them, but because of your interest in anti-terrorism and all the rest of it. So how did you find working alongside the Russian military and the contrast between that and the Ukrainian army? How did you balance that out in how you deal with those situations when you're trying to cover, you're trying to be dispassionate, you're trying to do a professional job, and you've got two from the same country, as it were, who take a very different view? How did you deal with that?
I've always been interested in the war history, and I did a fine project about 10 years ago about the veterans of the Russian and Soviet anti-terrorist and special forces. And I believe that I had spent quite a lot of time talking to the army guys, and I believe I do understand their psychology, and it gave me some kind of background in terms of, I thought I was prepared, but you know, I wasn't, because my first experience of trying to get embed with Ukrainian battalions, it was like really appalling. As soon as I have arrived, they said to me, "You're not welcome here because you're Russian, you're from Moscow, you're a representative of an occupying country." And I thought, wow, okay. I pack my stuff and I step out from the gates with empty hands. And I had to, you know, swallow my pride, and this is what I did. I suggested to the guy who was responsible for kind of PR with this battalion. He was a computer guy, and he looked at my stuff. I showed him my website. He looked through my portfolio, and what we did, we made a slideshow. We have organized an evening of photography at the Ukrainian battalion, right there on their base. And I was running through
That's a pretty unusual way of getting help, I have to say.
Well, it wasn't nice, because some people were still incredibly obstinate, because if I would show pictures from the Bolshoi theater, they would say, "Why are you showing this to us? We have our own theater in Kiev." If I would show some pictures of steel smelter, they would say, "Why are you showing it? We have our own steel smelters." So in the end, one of their top guys, I think it was a head of staff, he looked at it, "Okay, enough, the circus is over. This guy will stay. I like him because he's trying to be honest with us. Can't you see it?" And so they've given me access. And that was just even before the commander of the unit arrived from Kiev. Now, regarding the propaganda effect, how difficult was it? It was very difficult. It was a non-stop battle with myself. It was a battle with some of my employees for whom it was very much black and white. It's just bad Russians, good Ukrainians, or vice versa. And I spent, you know, a long time explaining this is far more complicated. The world is not black and white. The world is gray. There are semitones in it. You really are to look into the history, and I had to explain the history of the thing. Sometimes it did help, sometimes it didn't. You know, I've lost friends. I stopped communicating with probably 10 or 15 people because they were pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. Some people delete me on a Facebook. Well, not a big deal. I did the same as well. And the most tragic experience for me was ruin of my relationships with my father. I visited my parents in 2015. Just basically, my mother was in a appalling condition, so I had to go. And my father was taking me to the train station, and we talked. And out of a sudden, he switched topic, and he started asking me, "Can't you see that Ukrainians are killing ethnic Russian population?" I said, "No, Daddy, I don't think so." "Why you disagree?" "Well, because it's a lie." "That's a lie." And then he asked me, "Don't you know that there is a swastika, there's a Nazi flag on top of the main church in Lvov town?" I said, "Daddy, it's a crap. Why don't you believe me? I'm your son. I have been there, right? You haven't been there. The guy from the TV hasn't been there. They're telling you a lie. Why don't you believe me? I'm your son." And he couldn't give me the answer. He said goodbye. I said goodbye. All the way home on the train, I was thinking about it, and we did not communicate for more than 3 months, and we're still having difficulties in terms of communication. We basically stopped hearing each other.
It's interesting you talk about this. Before I came here, I spoke to a former colleague of mine who has lived and worked for many years in Moscow, Mark Franchetti, and he said, one of the things I wanted to ask him about was the questions that I should be asking. And he said, talk to them, ask them about how their friends, family feel about the Ukraine. Because there are very few people in Russia who do not either have family or they know people who are there. And Dima's experience, with your father is particularly painful because I guess it's a generational thing as well.
Of course, he's a Soviet man.
Yeah. But can I ask you, Sergey, I mean, in Dima's case, his father clearly has a very rigid view about the place of Ukraine within the Russian state. I mean, have you experienced difficulties with family or friends when you've tried to discuss why you do what you do and why you don't maybe see a problem working for, as you say, a very respected news organization which does try its best to show a balanced hand? Because, as we know, for many people, anything that comes out of America will be seen as anti-Putin and vice versa. So how have you found talking about this to friends?
Well, first, there is a personal experience that we both encountered in Ukraine and things that we've seen with our own eyes. But then there is a news and the whole new world of post-truth, as we call it. People sometimes start to argue with me, saying that that's something they've seen with their own eyes. I said, like, how did you see that? They said, I saw that on YouTube. And
YouTube.
And yeah, so when you have to fight YouTube, that's one thing. But also there is a thing that you have to fight with your friends, that I lost many among Ukrainians who were threatened or fought with pro-Russian separatists, and then they turned, or sometimes with Russian military that were kind of undercover in helping the separatists, and some of my friends were trapped in a big siege in Ilovaisk, and then they turned on me after escaping that. So they were let's say, angry. They were.
But what were they angry with you?
They turned that on me from being angry on what's happened to them, but on me as a representative, as a guy with Russian accent.
As a representative of what? As a Russian who
as a country, as a representative of a country. So the guy we used to travel together suddenly turned on me because he was trapped and he was nearly killed in this trap in Ilovaisk. And that's the toll that we had to take with working and being in Ukraine.
It's probably worth pointing out, I mean, even 100 years ago, Soviet propaganda was describing the Donbass region particularly, not because Ukraine obviously is a huge country, and the north and the west are very different from the industrial heartland. And it was described in Soviet propaganda as the heart of Russia. It was the place, it's where the mines are, where the steel comes from. And it fed all these factories all over Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why that map is still very sharply divided, and also why the south and places like the Crimea are still seen as hugely important, significantly, strategically important by the Russians, who feel, I think, probably safe in saying that the Ukraine is not being portrayed as the complex story that it is, and presumably this is one of the reasons why you are both treated with suspicion, which it makes this particular conflict a good example of where do you draw the line? Is there a line to be drawn? Do you say, no, this is work. I will do the very best I can. But how hard is it? I mean, just come back to you, Sergey, about talking to friends who cannot understand why you don't feel one way or the other, that you remain neutral. Is it possible, my question, to remain neutral in this?
Well, in a war, it's no way to remain neutral for anybody, I think. And this is why, I mean, if the war touches your family, your friends, and the vicinity around you, and around your habitat. And this is why I decided that I would stop working in Ukraine and reporting about the conflict in Ukraine, because I realized that I cannot be independent enough in that conflict. And
Can I stop you there? When you
yeah.
say you could not be independent enough, is this because you felt personally under too much pressure to answer the questions, impossible questions that were being put to you?
Well, in a way, yes. There were questions that I felt like I would rather avoid, because they are too touching for me. And I had some bad experience. I needed to work with a psychologist to overcome that. And so, accumulating all of those thoughts, I decided like it's better to. I'm still working as a conflict photographer, but then I realized that as far as it from my home, the best I can do my job and be more independent.
So basically, you're saying that because I know obviously you've worked in across the region, that it was easier for you to work in Libya and Syria than it was in the Donbass.
Well, yeah, because the sides that are in a conflict, not in your region, you can independently listen to both of them and understand and tell their stories. But when one part of your family or your friends are fighting, you cannot. You're obliged to take a side, or you don't want to listen to them at all. You cannot engage into that conflict. So my decision is just to abandon thinking or working in Ukraine.
And step away. Now, I mean, Dima, I know that you have a long-standing desire to continue to try to cover this conflict, which has been going on for so long and shows no sign of ending, even though we don't hear about it in the news. It's one of those stories that just won't go away. The Ukraine continues to be a damaged place, and it's hard to know how it will come through this. But can you explain how you hope to still continue to go back as a Russian, knowing the difficulties that you face, because you feel compelled to try to continue to tell this impossible story from both sides? How are you going to do that?
I shall pick it from where Sergey has stopped, because it's interesting what he mentioned. I find it interesting. It was very challenging, always challenging, and there were periods when I thought, okay, this is it. I'm not coming back, because it's just not possible to continue to look at all this mess. And I felt very angry myself so many times, because one of the reasons why I hate wars is because I perfectly well understand that every war doesn't kill the right people. It doesn't kill soldiers, it produces casualties, civilian casualties, who are not related to all this conflict. They were trying to avoid this conflict. And looking at all these countless funerals, I mean, I remember myself on MH17 site. That was probably the site where I have seen the highest concentration of fragments of dead bodies on the ground in one place. It was probably much worse than even in Beslan. And that was very traumatic. That was one of the reasons why I thought I'm not going back. And unfortunately, from time to time, because as you understand that working in the hostile environment, you usually work as a member of a team, you have a reporter, and it's very important to have a qualified, adequate reporter. Sometimes I enjoyed a company of experienced reporter who did understand the region, who had knowledge of the place, but sometimes I had someone like utter fool. And eventually I've had a quite drastic experience with one lady from Al Jazeera, and I just filed an email to her editor saying, please, leave me alone, I'm not working with her. She doesn't know what she's doing, she doesn't understand the conflict, that's it. And he came back to me. He was an experienced man. He used to work for Appropriate magazine before. He said, look, let's discuss. He talked to her. Well, she came back with a sour face, but we managed to neutralize it. But mainly, I was lucky. My colleagues from Stern or from Spiegel, in particular, Christian Neff was one of the most legendary reporters. He did cover Afghanistan before, he did cover Chechnya before, and he knew very well Ukraine, and he knew the history of the conflict. So when you work with someone like this, you feel yourself safe. You feel yourself that you are in the right hands, you know what you're doing, you know what kind of story you want. And what's interesting also, my wife is fluent in German, and so she was following the stories of Christian. She would read every story we've been working together at, and she would say, look, this is not an article in the magazine, this is literature. So I took it as a very interesting compliment. And I was trying to express myself to fit, in terms of photography, with his style, so that everything is in harmony. So when you concentrate on technical things, when you focus on geometry of the story, then it becomes easier. You basically leave alone all the propaganda effect and all that. But yes, it hits, because you may have a problem out of the blue. People attack you from time to time, and it's not nice. Somebody wrote me on a Facebook for a long time from this or the other account. He basically was chasing me. And I blocked him once, then I blocked him second time. He was basically chasing me. He insisted that I agree with his point of view. He really insisted. That was not nice.
So can I ask you both about, because this is a conflict that we're not reading about very much. Every now and again we hear, but most of the time we don't see anything coming from frontline reporting. So can I ask you both, what do you think the hardest thing about covering this story is now? Because each of the conflict areas that you've all worked in, you both worked in, you know, they all go through periods of transition where there's a lot of focus, a lot of interest, either for one reason or another. And this intermittently is one of those stories that keeps coming back and it doesn't go away. But at the moment there seems to be an impasse. Half the country would like to move towards the West. The other half has made it very clear that it wishes to stay with Russia, but it's an independent country. You know, it is not being invaded. I mean, Putin has taken control of the Crimea, but the rest of it, it's like there are no boots on the ground yet. I mean, in terms of proper Russian intervention. So how, if you were asked to go back now, I know you've said that you prefer not to, you'd rather go and get shot at somewhere else rather than shouted at, in a way, which is a curious but understandable reason. But if you were to go back, you say if the New York Times said to you, no, we're going back in, Sergey, how would you go about it right now?
Well, you asked about the hardest thing part, and I think that finding the right words to talk to people on both sides is the hardest thing, because you never know what kind of terms the news and the propaganda uses, and you might just put yourself in trouble by naming some simple things with the wrong words. I mean, you know, there are different terms of how the one side names the other side, and you might say it's a separatist, and you might say rebels, and you might say bandits or terrorists or whoever, right? And
Right.
once you might use the wrong word, and it will set you in whole trouble just in a second. It will turn people against you. That's hard.
But the simple answer is that you don't want to go back.
Huh?
You don't want, but I know you've made that
I mean,
explanation, but
I know that I will say no if I would be
you
asked.
would say no.
I would say no, yes.
And you would say no because of the psychological damage that you just...
Because bringing into consideration a bunch of things.
But sorry to interrupt you, but the important distinction between the damage that photographers have and receive through working in conflict zones, which we discussed, and photographers have been here and talked about it. Robin Hammond was talking earlier about mental health issues, and you know, we know all about PTSD now. We're well aware of all that. Giles was talking very movingly about the need to move forward from receiving terrible injuries. And last time round, we were talking about the consequences of putting yourself in harm's way. In your case, the idea is, no, I won't go back. It's not about being shot at. It's not about the threat of being bombed or anything. It is the psychological impact of coming home and still feeling that perhaps you're on a front line.
In this way, yes, because while you're on the front line, it's always there is black and white. There is danger. There is safety, and coming back home, you have to learn it again. And there is a war movie when a guy stands in front of the shelf of still water at the supermarket, and he cannot choose that. And I went through that, and I had the same experience when you can't make a choice in a normal life. You have to start walking again, and learning that life is not just pros and contras. It's also have, as Dima said, shades of gray. And I think everyone who was in frontline has experience and had to go through this working with the psychologists and just vanishing all these bad memories and making them not come back with you in your dreams or in your normal life. You need to become a guy who can easily speak about this on a stage without suffering.
Dima, you already spoke about the fact that life is never about black and white. It might seem like it at certain times, but mostly it's versions of grey. But this particular story, and I come back to the map as just a way into it, and that was in 2010. And I don't suppose it's changed an awful lot since then. If opinions had lasted so long for hundreds of years, whether it was for religious purposes or whatever, I don't suppose opinions on the ground in Ukraine have changed very much. You've still got this huge divide. So there is, if not black and white, then blue and red, whatever you want to call it. So if you were to go back, would you do anything differently? Would you approach this story in a different way, or would you advise someone? You know, the Ukraine story is just going on and on and on. It shows no sign of resolution. How do you tell that story?
Right. Well, first of all, I have no illusions in terms of going back because I have been banned from both sides, so I cannot come back. I have been banned by the separatists because they believe I was pro-Western or pro-Ukrainian, and I have been banned by the Ukrainians because I have been officially named a sympathizer of the terrorists. It's silly. I still continue to hold relationships with some of the veterans of these Ukrainian battalions. We do send congratulations for Christmas to each other, and Like today, I have received a bunch of likes on my Facebook when I updated the news about my exhibition here. So the human relationships, they do help. But the government, you know, they don't care.
When you say the government, which government?
Both governments, they don't care. As I said, I was banned by both sides.
No, when you say the government, you mean the governments in Ukraine, or the
Oh, yeah,
Russian
yeah,
government
yeah.
and the Ukraine government?
Yeah, I was included. The Ukrainian government, they included me into the blacklist because it's such a silly story. Long time ago, in 2018, I think so, I visited Donetsk on invitation by a local university, and I did a lecture on how to structurize your work in terms of working on a picture story or reportage, and that was in Donetsk. And immediately they picked it up from this. They said, okay, well, Beliakov is visiting an occupied territory. He's reading lectures to occupants, blah, blah, blah. So he's a terrorist sympathizer. Well, what can I do? What can I do? In terms of perspectives of this conflict, believe it or not, I knew right from the start that it's going to be ugly, because I've been in Ukraine 40 or 50 times altogether, and I think that I understood the region, and I could see well that the Ukrainian government did not understand their own people. They did not feel the difference between the Ukrainians living in the Donetsk region and Ukrainians living in the western Ukraine. Two different phenomena. They would not listen to their own people. They would not want to understand what their demands are. When they said, we want to be EU, we want to be NATO, well, sky is the limit, well, perfect. But did you ask your own people? Do you think that miners from Donetsk would be willing to be a member of NATO? Maybe not. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, it's just seriously, listen, I do blame West for what happened.
You blame the West?
Yes, I do blame the West, because at one hand, the Western countries have put false illusions into the heads of Ukrainians. And on the other hand, the West did not do much to help the Ukraine when the war began. They were just beating around the bush. Seriously. You fed them with...
What did you think they should have done?
Well, first of all, they should have said to the Ukrainians from the very beginning that, hey guys, look, let's take these demands about EU and NATO off the table, because it's not going to happen. You're not ready. This is a red line. Don't cross it. Stop here. Because what the new independent government of the Ukraine, one after the other new independent government did, they were flirting with the West and saying, we want to be EU, we want to be NATO, and on the same time, they were saying to Moscow, oh, please, 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 we would want a discount on the Russian gas, and we also want you to pay triple price for the Russian Navy in Sevastopol. But I'm sorry, you and I know, in the politics, it's give and take symptom. You do something for me, I do something for you in exchange. And Ukrainian governments, they were trying to chase 2, even 3 birds at a time. It's not possible. And the West, they never said it's not going to happen. They fed them with silly, empty illusions. And in the end, what do we have? You can say many things about Putin. You can say he is undertaker of democracy. We know what he is. He is incredibly sufficient. He's the most efficient politician on this planet. He knows what he wants, he knows what and he always gets it. So that's why no wonder that Ukraine is gridlocked. They basically are gridlocked. But is it just Putin to blame? Probably not. The Ukrainian government have made their own mistakes, and once again, the West is to blame for leaving Ukraine in this mess after feeding them with empty promises.
Sergey, can I ask you, I mean, we're coming to the end of our conversation, but I mean, that's a very powerful statement, and one, as you say, based on traveling in and out of the Ukraine for many years and working, primarily for the Western press. Now, do you feel that, even though, obviously, say you have this very close working relationship with the New York Times, do you think that it's properly understood, and also do you think that that people make the proper attempt to explain this situation? Because at the moment the Ukraine continues, despite its huge significance, to be a failed state, and it seems, certainly another friend of mine, a former foreign editor I work with, believes that it's in everyone's interest that the Ukraine should remain a failed state, because that's the easiest way to deal with this situation. I mean, do you agree with that?
I think right now there is no way back. It will remain this failed state, and probably there will be a belt of this kind of a failed state around the Russian borders, because that's the way probably the status quo will be okay for both sides, for Russia and for EU, because all small countries are trying to either lean to the West, either lean to the Russia. And inside the country, there are communities that support one or other idea, and they probably will clash inside their countries, and we might see more civil disputes in other countries. Same as Belarus, for example, right now.
Yes. And there it is, really. The idea is, where do you draw the line? Is the line already drawn for you? I mean, photographers, journalists everywhere do not like the idea of there being lines. The whole point is to get beyond them, get behind them, to get the story. Don't become the story, but certainly go and get it, and then use your position of privilege and influence in a way to try to get as balanced a story as you can out to the wider world. And as we've heard from both Dima and Sergey, this is not always the case. It's not always possible. And both sides have to bear responsibility for that. In the case of these two brave photographers, they've tried their very, very hardest in their own backyard, as it were, to tell this story. And both have found, one because he's banned, he can't go back, however many times he's tried to work on both sides, and the other one because in the end, going home, it became impossible to have a normal, balanced conversation, because his home country is divided down the middle about what to do. That's the line. And thank you for listening to our friends here for trying to explain how hard it is sometimes in a conflict zone where it's not just about who's got the guns. Thank you very much. Sergey
Thank you.
and Dimi.